Hi guys, welcome back to Writing with Miss Maxie. I hope you all had a great weekend and you're ready to start writing again. So let's take a look at our materials and our I can statement for the day. It is our first day of our new lesson and I'm super excited to start talking about narrative writing with you. Today you're going to need your iReady writing books and a green, a yellow, and a red marker, colored pencil, or crayon. So feel free to pause your video, go find your materials, and come back when you're ready. And here we have our friend Herschel on the writing path. I know this picture is a little bit blurry, but I think it's better than the document camera because we can see the whole thing and I'm not having to shuffle it around. So let's wave to our friend Herschel. And he says, come with me on the writing path. Since we're learning about a new topic today, narrative writing, instead of informational like we talked about last time, we're going to start back at step 1, learn about writing. And today we will find out what kind of writing you will do. Read a model of the writing type. So the 3 types it has listed are opinion, informative, and narrative. And like I said, we're focusing on the narrative today. Our I can statements for the day are I can identify a narrative paragraph and I can analyze a mentor text. So like our friend Herschel told us when we were looking at the road to writing, today we will read and study a narrative paragraph, and that will help us write our own narrative paragraphs in the future. Let's open up our books to page 40. I'll share on my screen what it will look like so you can see. It will say writing a narrative paragraph. Step 1, learn about narrative writing. What is a narrative? A narrative tells a made-up or a real story. The characters can be people or plants, animals, and objects that behave like people. Herschel said, I wrote a story about a dragon's trip to the moon. I also wrote a story about my vacation. So, like he told us, a narrative can be a story that we make up, like a tiger who sings in a rock band, or it could also be a real story. I could write a story about being a teacher. So in your head right now, can you think of an example of a fiction story or a nonfiction story? Maybe you think about some of the books we've read in class. For example, Nelson Mandela was nonfiction because he was a real person. A fictional story we read, maybe Stregonona. Okay, think of a couple more examples in your head, and you can whisper them to the screen. All right, so now that you've started brainstorming some fiction and nonfiction, let's look at the components or the parts of narrative writing. So right here it says, what is narrative writing? Writers tell a story about one or more events. They include details to describe how characters think, feel, and act. Narrative writing has a beginning that introduces the characters and setting, a middle that shows how the characters think, feel, and act, and an end that finishes the story and makes sense. This kind of reminds me of when we talked about informational writing, because informational writing also had a beginning, a middle, and an end. But this is kind of different because I don't remember talking about characters and setting in our informational writing. We mostly talked about resources and facts and details with informational. So that's one difference between informational and narrative writing. Before we move on, I'm going to ask you a couple questions and I want you to just think about it, pause your video if you need to, and then whisper your answer to the screen. My first question for you is, what does the beginning of a narrative do? What does the beginning of a narrative do? That's right. The beginning introduces the characters and the setting. Okay, what does the middle of the narrative tell us? Why is it important? Why is the middle important? That's right. The middle shows us how the characters think, feel, and act. And why should the end of the narrative make sense? Why should the end of the narrative make sense? That's right. So the readers won't be confused and they'll know that the story is finished. So let's go to page 41 and we're going to read a narrative about a real person. As we read, I want you to think about who the characters are, when and where the narrative is set, and how the characters are thinking, feeling, and acting. Okay, here we go. Ava wrote a narrative paragraph that retells some important events in George Washington Carver's life. Let's read it. The Plant Doctor by Ava Johnson. George Washington Carver was born in Missouri around 1864. George first became interested in plants as a little boy. He decided to create a special garden. He watched the plants and learned. "Show me how you grow," he whispered. Then one day, a woman asked George to look at a rose bush. "It won't bloom," she said. George moved the woman's rose bush into the sun. Soon, beautiful roses covered the bush. People began calling George the Plant Doctor. Sorry about that. People began calling George the Plant Doctor. Later, when George grew up, he helped solve farmers' problems all over the country. Okay, so what was this paragraph about? You can pause the video, rewind and listen again if you need to. Whisper your answer to the screen. This paragraph was about George Washington Carver. And what happened to him? Whisper your answer. So as a boy, George learned about plants around him and he helped other people with their plants and he kept on helping people as he grew up. Okay, so we just read our paragraph as a reader. We're going to reread it this time as a writer. So this time we'll think about how the writer put the beginning, the middle, and the end together. Can we identify the characters and the setting? And is it clear what the characters are doing? Does the end make sense? As we're reading, keep these questions in mind. Here we go. The Plant Doctor by Ava Johnson. George Washington Carver was born in Missouri around 1864. George first became interested in plants as a little boy. He decided to create a special garden. He watched the plants and learned. "Show me how you grow," he whispered. Then one day, a woman asked George to look at a rose bush. "It won't bloom," she said. George moved the woman's rose bush into the sun. Soon, beautiful roses covered the bush. People began calling George the plant doctor. Later, when George grew up, he helped solve farmers' problems all over the country. All right, so we just read in our writer state of mind. So let's look at these on the side and we'll go back through and underline parts of the beginning, the middle, and the end. Starting with the beginning. Number 1, did Ava write a beginning? Underline the characters and setting in green. Okay, guys, so pause your video right now. Find your green marker or pencil or crayon and underline the characters and setting in green. Okay, I know that the character was George Washington Carver, and I know the setting is Missouri around 1864. So take a minute and fix your paper if you haven't already underlined this in green before we move on to number 2. Number 2, did she write a middle? Underline details about how the characters think, feel, or act in yellow. Okay, so let's go back and read each sentence and see if it's a detail about how the characters were thinking, feeling, or acting. George first became interested in plants as a little boy. I'm going to underline that because it's telling me what he thinks and what he's interested in. He decided to create a special garden. Well, yeah, that's an action, so I'm also going to underline that in yellow. He watched the plants and learned. Yep, that's another action. Show me how you grow, he whispered. That is another action. Then one day, a woman asked George to look at a rose bush. Okay, that's also another action a woman in his life took. It won't bloom, she said. George moved the woman's rose bush into the sun. Okay, those are also actions. And I think we forgot a character. The woman is also a character in our story, so let's underline that in green. Okay, I think that's most of our middle section. That was the main part of the story. So let's move on to number 3 and do the end. Number 3, did she write the end? Underline the words that finish the story in red. So again, feel free to pause your video, underline the end in red, and come back when you're ready to go over it together. For number 3, I just decided to underline this last sentence in red because that's how Ava finished the story by saying later, when George grew up, he helped solve farmers' problems all over the country. That wrapped it up for us. Okay, guys, that is pretty much it for writing today, with the exception of our write time, which I'll show you in a second. Just make sure to finish underlining in your book before you move on. For our write time today, I have an assignment on Schoology for you, and it's going to ask you, what did you learn about the narrative the more times that you read it? What did you learn about the narrative the more times that you read it? All right, so feel free to go back and listen to the story again if you need to hear it again. Don't forget to upload your response to Schoology, and I will see you tomorrow. Have a good rest of your day. Bye, guys.